The hunger that ate Europe. How medieval people survived nature's cruelest test. Picture this. You wake up in your cramped wooden hut to find frost coating the inside walls in July. Outside, your neighbors are grinding tree bark into flour while their children huddle with goats for warmth. This wasn't some apocalyptic nightmare. This was daily life for millions of Europeans during the Little Ice Age, a climatic catastrophe that turned the continent into a frozen hellscape for over 5 centuries. When the world turned cold, the year was 1315, and something had gone terribly wrong with the natural order. What medieval chroniclers couldn't have known was that they were witnessing the beginning of the most devastating climate shift in recorded history. The Little Ice Age had arrived, and it would hold Europe in its icy grip until the mid-1800s, fundamentally reshaping civilization itself. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. People didn't just survive this frozen apocalypse, they innovated, adapted, and emerged stronger. Their methods, however, were often so extreme they sound like medieval horror stories. The Great Famine, when desperation became innovation. The crisis began with the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, when torrential rains destroyed crops across northern Europe for 7 consecutive years. Imagine walking through London or Paris during this time. The streets would have been filled with skeletal figures, their hollow eyes searching desperately for anything edible. Contemporary accounts describe people so hungry they resorted to eating their own leather shoes, boiled and seasoned with whatever herbs they could scavenge. But the real ingenuity emerged in the forests. When wheat and barley failed, Europeans turned to an unlikely savior: tree bark. Not just any bark, mind you, but specifically the inner bark of birch, pine, and elm trees. Medieval survival experts, for that's what many became, discovered that this cambium layer could be dried, ground into a coarse flour, and mixed with whatever grain remained to create a bread that, while bitter and difficult to digest, could sustain life. The process was grueling. Families would send their children into the woods with sharp knives to strip bark from trees, a practice so widespread that entire forests began to die. The bark would then be boiled repeatedly to remove the most toxic tannins, dried in the sun or by precious firewood, and ground using whatever tools were available. The resulting bark bread was dark, dense, and often caused severe digestive problems, but it kept people alive when nothing else would. When livestock became roommates, perhaps even more shocking to modern sensibilities was the practice of cohabitation with animals during the coldest months. But this wasn't just about warmth, it was a sophisticated survival strategy that reveals the ingenuity of medieval people facing impossible odds. Picture a typical peasant home during the depths of winter in the 1600s. The single room would be shared not just by an entire extended family, but also by their most valuable animals: pigs, goats, chickens, and sometimes even cows. This arrangement served multiple purposes that showcase medieval pragmatism at its finest. First, the animals provided crucial warmth. A single cow generates roughly the same heat as 10 humans, while pigs and goats could raise the temperature of a small dwelling by several degrees. The difference between life and death during the brutal winters when temperatures plummeted far below anything we experience today. But the benefits went far beyond heating. Animals also provided early warning systems for dangers like fires, intruders, or structural collapse from heavy snow. Their acute senses often alerted families to threats that human senses would miss. Moreover, having animals indoors meant their precious body heat wasn't being wasted outside, and their manure could be immediately collected and stored for fuel or fertilizer come spring. The ingenious arts of frozen survival. The Little Ice Age forced Europeans to become masters of resource conservation and innovation. They developed techniques that seem almost magical in their efficiency. Take food preservation, for instance. With shorter growing seasons and unpredictable weather, people had to make summer's harvest last through winters that could stretch for 8 months. They created elaborate systems of root cellars that utilized the Earth's natural insulation, storing vegetables in sand, sawdust, or even in sealed ceramic pots buried underground. Meat was preserved through smoking, salting, and a technique called potting, sealing cooked meat in its own fat to create an airtight barrier against spoilage. But perhaps most ingenious were the communal warming strategies. Entire villages would designate certain buildings as warming houses, where families could gather during the worst cold snaps, sharing body heat and fuel resources. These became centers of community life, where stories were told, crafts were practiced, and marriages were arranged, turning survival into social cohesion. The unexpected consequences of crisis. Here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. The Little Ice Age didn't just challenge medieval Europeans, it transformed them. The constant threat of starvation led to agricultural innovations that would eventually contribute to population growth in later centuries. Crop rotation techniques improved, new cold-resistant varieties of grains were developed, and farming practices became more sophisticated. The need to preserve and transport food efficiently sparked improvements in trade networks and storage technology. The pressure to maximize every calorie led to the development of more nutritious cooking methods and the discovery of new food sources. Even tree bark consumption led to knowledge about which plants could sustain human life, knowledge that would prove valuable during later famines and wars. The social revolution of survival. The Little Ice Age also catalyzed profound social changes. Traditional feudal hierarchies sometimes crumbled when lords could no longer provide protection from starvation. Peasants who developed successful survival strategies gained social mobility. Women, often the managers of household food resources, gained influence as their skills became crucial for family survival. Perhaps most remarkably, the crisis fostered a culture of mutual aid that transcended traditional class boundaries. Sharing food, fuel, and shelter became not just charitable acts but survival necessities. Communities developed elaborate systems of reciprocal obligation that would influence European social structures for centuries. Legacy of the Ice. When the Little Ice Age finally ended in the mid-1800s, Europe had been fundamentally transformed. The innovations born from desperation improved agriculture, better food preservation, more efficient heating systems, and stronger community bonds helped fuel the population boom and economic growth of the early modern period. The people who ground bark into bread and slept with their livestock weren't just surviving, they were laying the groundwork for the modern world. Their story reminds us that human ingenuity doesn't just flourish in comfort, but often reaches its greatest heights when facing the seemingly impossible. The Little Ice Age stands as perhaps history's greatest testament to human adaptability. In the face of a climate catastrophe that lasted longer than the entire history of the United States, medieval Europeans didn't just endure, they innovated their way to a better future, one handful of bark flour at a time.